11 languages? Omar al-Farouk's laugh cracked across the glass-walled penthouse, sharp and amused. That's what you came up here to say? Victor Hale, COO of Al-Farouk Global, and a man who collected other people's weaknesses like trophies, leaned forward with a smirk. Cute claim. Maybe they picked up words from TikTok captions. Terrence and Tobias Reed stood side by side just inside the room. Their shirts were pressed but thin at the elbows, backpacks dragging at their shoulders. For an instant, Terrence's throat tightened, and Tobias felt heat crawl up his neck, the sting of being dismissed before they'd even begun. Thomas Reed planted his boots on the marble, a quiet wall between his sons and the two executives. The janitor's coveralls couldn't hide the power in his stance. He flicked a glance toward the security guard by the elevator. One wrong step and his badge, his job, everything could vanish. Omar's eyes glittered. You boys sure you want to keep talking? Last chance to walk back that fairy tale. Terrence breathed once. Slow. Tobias straightened his spine. They traded the smallest nod, a silent promise not to shrink. We're sure, Terrence said, voice steady now. Victor chuckled low. This'll be fun. Thomas's shoulders squared. You asked them to speak. Let them. The skyline behind the glass burned with late afternoon light, but the room itself felt sealed, the air thick with challenge. Omar leaned in, smile narrowing to a blade. All right, prodigies. Show me these 11 languages you think you own. The twins didn't blink. Whatever tremor had touched them was gone, replaced by calm focus, the kind that made even a billionaire's laughter falter. Omar's laughter thinned into something sharper as he waved a hand toward the twins. Even your father barely belongs here, he said, his voice sliding between mockery and warning. The words landed heavy in the quiet, drawing a flicker of discomfort from the security guard by the elevator. Victor Hale seized the opening, leaning back with an expression that mixed amusement and disdain. Custodians shouldn't raise daydreamers, he said, each syllable polished for cruelty. It only sets them up to crash harder. Victor Hale, the COO who collected people's weaknesses like trophies, smiled without warmth. By the elevator, the guard glanced over. Thomas knew one misstep could cost his badge. For a heartbeat, the room froze, the Manhattan skyline blazing behind them like a stage light on an unkind scene. Terrence felt his face heat, the sting of an insult aimed at their father sharper than anything hurled at them. Tobias's fingers curled around the strap of his backpack, knuckles whitening. He caught his brother's eye, silently urging him to hold steady. Thomas Reed moved before either boy could answer. A single step forward, measured and solid, shifted the balance of the room. The soft scuff of his boot against the marble sounded louder than Omar's laugh had moments ago. He planted himself squarely between his sons and the executives, shoulders broad, gaze level. My sons don't daydream, Thomas said, his voice deep, each word clean as stone. They deliver. The sentence hung there, cutting through the haze of contempt. Even Victor paused, his smirk flickering as though unsure whether to press or retreat. Omar raised a brow, pretending indifference, but the billionaire's eyes tracked the janitor's stance, unshaken, unbowed. Thomas kept his body angled just enough to block the boys from view, but not enough to hide the pride in his face. He didn't fidget or glance around for permission. He stood as if he owned a right no one could take, not here, not anywhere. The twins drew quiet strength from that posture, the heat in their cheeks cooling into resolve. Omar leaned back, fingers drumming once on the glass table. All right, he said, a trace of challenge replacing mockery. Your father wants to stand behind you. Let's see if you can stand on your own. No one spoke. The hum of the city outside bled faintly through the glass, a reminder of how high the stakes were, reputations, terms, the fragile chance to prove that talent could outshine pedigree. Terrence lifted his chin a fraction, Tobias set his shoulders, and behind them, Thomas remained steady, the silent proof that some lines couldn't be crossed. Then say them, Omar murmured, tapping the glass once. All 11. Terrence didn't break eye contact with Omar. English, he began, his voice firm but even. Spanish, Arabic, Swahili, Mandarin, French, Russian, Italian, Portuguese, Hindi, Zulu. He spoke each name as if laying cards on a table, slow enough for clarity, quick enough to show he didn't need to search. Tobias stepped in without missing a beat. Buenos dias, señor, he said in warm Spanish, then shifted into a crisp phrase of Arabic, rolling the sounds with easy precision. He followed with a burst of lilting French, a handful of Russian syllables, a clean Chinese greeting. Every language landed clean, a new brushstroke on the silence. Victor Hale gave a short laugh, crossing one leg over the other. Google phrases, he said, dismissive. Half the kids in Brooklyn can mimic accents if they spend long enough on YouTube. Tobias's smile didn't falter, but Terrence felt the heat of irritation crawl up the back of his neck. He steadied it, pulling his shoulders back. These aren't copy and paste lines, Terrence replied, calm as stone. Ask for anything deeper than hello, and you'll find we don't stumble. Omar's eyes narrowed slightly, a shift so small it almost passed unnoticed. He stopped drumming his fingers and leaned forward, elbows on the glass. The mocking curve at the corner of his mouth eased, curiosity beginning to replace scorn. Thomas stood silent behind the twins, but his stance widened, a quiet pillar of support. He caught the guard's glance again, the reminder that his badge and paycheck were tied to how this moment played out. His jaw set tighter, but he didn't speak. This was their arena now. Tobias switched gears, delivering a smooth sentence in Hindi, then a playful line in Portuguese. Terrence followed with a proverb in Swahili, his pronunciation sharp, steady. The rhythm between them was quick, like a volley they'd rehearsed 100 times in the Bronx library's shadowed corners. Victor's smirk faltered for half a second, then returned, thinner. Parlor tricks, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier ease. Omar raised one hand for silence. Enough, he said, not harsh, but deliberate. He studied the boys, weighing what he'd just heard against everything he thought he knew about Janitor's children. The gold light from the windows caught the edges of his face, sharpening the lines of focus now settling there. Tobias let the quiet stretch, daring them to dismiss him again. Terrence stood tall, calm settling over him like armor. For the first time since they'd entered, the room wasn't laughing at them. It was listening. Omar's smile thinned into something sharper. Say something real, he said, the words a challenge meant to close the door they'd cracked open. Tobias didn't hesitate. He stepped forward just enough to own the space and let a line of Arabic roll out. Deep vowels, clean consonants, the sound rich and deliberate. The language filled the glass room like a low drumbeat, weight settling on every syllable. Terrence followed an instant later, translating without breaking the rhythm. If you aim for honor, he said, voice steady, don't settle for less than the stars. He let the words hang there, not rushing, not softening them. The penthouse went still. Even the hum of the city outside seemed to fade. Omar's eyes narrowed, the curve of amusement sliding from his mouth as he measured what he'd just heard. Victor shifted in his chair, biting the inside of his cheek. Reciting lines won't save you, he muttered, but the confidence in his tone was gone. Tobias answered with another short phrase, the sounds precise, almost percussive. Terrence met it with clean English. Courage isn't for the cautious. They didn't explain or offer context. The delivery itself was proof. Thomas stayed rooted behind them, gaze steady, body a quiet wall. The guard by the elevator stood straighter, caught in the gravity of the moment. Omar leaned forward, elbows resting on the glass table. His fingers, which had been drumming moments ago, stilled. The billionaire searched for the stumble that would expose a trick, but there was none. The boys weren't performing. They were commanding the room. Terrence's eyes held Omar's as he spoke the last word, calm and sure. Tobias let the silence breathe, inviting anyone to doubt what they'd just witnessed. Something shifted in the air. A hairline crack in the wall of contempt. Omar inhaled slowly, curiosity edging out mockery. For the first time since they'd entered, the twins weren't fighting to be heard. They owned the floor. The glare of the penthouse glass gave way to the soft hum of fluorescent bulbs. Dust floated through shafts of amber light in the Bronx Public Library. Stacks leaned like tired soldiers, and at a scarred oak table sat Mr. Langston, sleeves rolled, silver hair framing a face carved by years of quiet fights. He slid a thick book across the wood toward Terrence and Tobias. "Knowledge is our armor," he said, voice low but edged with conviction. "Sharpen it, or someone will use ignorance against you." Tobias flipped the cover, fingers brushing brittle pages lined with Arabic script. "This is old," he murmured, half awed. "Older than anyone talking down to you today," Langston replied. He tapped a note written in his neat hand. "Find the root words. Trace how they bend meaning. You don't just learn language, you learn leverage." Terrence scribbled, pen steady. "What if we mess up?" Langston's smile was brief, not soft. "Then you get better. Mistakes are proof you're fighting." A chair scraped nearby. Auntie Rochelle, carrying a paper bag that smelled of cinnamon, set it on the table. "Eat," she said, eyes flicking toward their notebooks. "Brains need fuel." Tobias grinned, tearing off a corner of sweetbread, then ducked back over the text. Terrence adjusted the lamp so the margins glowed, absorbing every mark. Langston leaned closer, tapping a stanza with the end of his pen. "Read it aloud. Let the rhythm stick." Tobias obeyed, the words rolling clumsy at first, then cleaner. Terrence echoed in English, testing tone and weight. Langston nodded once. "Good. Again. Faster this time." In the hush of the reading room, the twins traded syllables like a quiet sparring match. Each repetition chipped away at hesitation, built a muscle memory deeper than fear. Rochelle watched them with a small, proud tilt of her head. "One day," she said, "you'll throw those words like stones." The boys looked up, meeting her gaze, then each other's. Determination sparked between them, silent but fierce. Langston closed the book gently, palm resting on its worn cover. "Carry this work back with you," he said. "Every lesson you take from here will walk beside you when someone tries to shove you aside." Outside, a siren wailed down Grand Concourse, thin through the windows. Inside, under the library's golden lamps, Terrence and Tobias bent again over their notes, armor in the making. Terrence unzipped his backpack, the sound sharp against the glassy quiet. He pulled out a slim folder, corners worn from nights in the Bronx library. One by one, he laid documents on the table, certificates from Columbia's summer linguistics program, a signed letter from the Bronx Library's translation course, screenshots of online exams stamped with perfect scores. Each page landed like a quiet challenge. Victor shifted, uncrossing and recrossing his legs. "Printouts," he said, aiming for a laugh, but landing closer to nerves. Tobias slid a phone from his pocket, thumb quick across the screen. "Not just paper," he said. A moment later, a face appeared. Professor Elaine Carter, framed by shelves stacked with dictionaries and old leather spines. "Professor," Terrence greeted, steady, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Terrence. Tobias." Carter's smile was brisk but warm. "Are you standing in front of Omar al-Farouk right now?" Omar raised a brow, leaning closer to the screen. "I am," he said carefully. "Good," Carter replied, her tone suddenly formal. "For the record, these young men rival my graduate students. Their retention and accuracy are extraordinary." Victor cleared his throat. "She could say that about anyone on a video call." Carter's gaze snapped to him, unblinking. "Mr. Hale, I've been teaching translation for 25 years. No one bluffs their way through my assessments." Tobias turned the phone slightly, letting the camera catch Omar's face. Ask her about the exam you flagged, Professor. Carter nodded. They took my highest-level Arabic comprehension test last month. Perfect score. Same with advanced Mandarin syntax. That doesn't happen by accident. Thomas watched quietly behind his sons, jaw locked, a flicker of pride breaking through the steel. The guard by the elevator shifted again, eyes drawn to the growing stack of proof. Omar reached out, fingertips grazing the edge of a certificate. The paper felt too solid to dismiss. He scanned a line of embossed text, then another, his brows tightening. Terrence stayed silent, letting the evidence speak. Tobias only added, "We brought originals, if you'd rather verify seals yourself." For the first time, the billionaire's laughter didn't echo in the room. It sat, unvoiced, caught behind calculation. He looked from the boys to Victor, then back to the phone where Carter waited, calm and expectant. The power in the room tilted, slight, but visible, toward the two kids who weren't supposed to have anything worth weighing. Malik Carter stood just outside the penthouse, posture loose but eyes alert. Through the narrow gap of the door, Terrence caught his gaze. Malik lifted his chin once, small, deliberate, then went back to pretending to study the hallway. Tobias felt the corner of his mouth twitch, almost a smile. That nod wasn't casual. It said, "We see you. Stand tall." Victor cleared his throat at the table, the sound sharp against the quiet. "Are we done showing homework?" he asked, but his glance slid toward the doorway, following whatever current had just moved between the boys and the guard. Thomas shifted subtly, one boot half turning toward Malik. No words, just the barest tilt of his head, an acknowledgement, and a promise that he'd keep the kids steady. For a heartbeat, Terrence's fingers brushed his pocket. A flash. Rochelle's bakery at dawn, the warm scent of cinnamon rolls and frying dough. She'd pushed a paper bag across the counter, eyes bright. "For after," she'd said, tucking a folded scrap inside. "Don't let them shrink you." Back in the penthouse, Tobias slid the note from his pocket and tapped it once against the table, a silent reminder. Then he tucked it back, focus settling in his eyes. Malik's shadow shifted, still there. The twins felt the weight of the Bronx at their backs. Rochelle, Mr. Langston, the kids who waited for proof that someone from their block could walk into a room like this and hold it. Omar watched them, expression unreadable. "Friends outside?" he asked lightly, but his gaze stayed longer than the words suggested. Tobias met his stare, calm. "Just people who know we're ready." Victor scoffed, but the sound lacked its earlier bite. Terrence straightened the stack of certificates, deliberate, then glanced toward the crack of the door where Malik remained. He gave the smallest nod back, quiet, fierce gratitude, and turned to face the next question. Tobias let the quiet stretch until even Victor stopped shifting in his chair. Then he spoke, voice low but clear enough to carry across the table. "Impossible," he said, "is just the possible that hasn't happened yet." The line landed like a stone dropped in water. No theatrics, just weight. Terrence glanced at his brother, a quick flicker of pride behind calm eyes. Thomas moved before the silence could splinter. He set one hand on Tobias's shoulder, steady and warm through the fabric of the boy's shirt. "That's right," he said, voice firm without needing to rise. "Stand tall." For the first time since the twins had stepped inside, Omar's grin lost its edge. The billionaire studied them as if trying to place what kind of ground he was standing on. Victor scoffed, too sharp, trying to reclaim the room. "Quotes don't win contracts," he said, but the bite didn't quite land. Tobias didn't flinch. "They open doors," he replied, still quiet. Terrence slid a finger along the top of the certificates, aligning their edges with deliberate care. "You asked for proof," he said. "Now you have it. We're not here to entertain." Omar leaned back slowly, elbows resting on the arms of his chair. His eyes moved from the boys to their father, to the faint silhouette of Malik by the door. The air seemed to cool a degree, the tension shifting into something more measured. Thomas kept his hand on Tobias's shoulder, gaze locked on Omar. There was no challenge in it, just certainty. as though the outcome had already been decided if the man across from them had sense enough to see it. Outside, traffic droned somewhere below the glass. Inside, the room felt suspended, waiting. Omar's fingers, which had been drumming moments ago, now stayed still against the polished wood. "Stand tall," Thomas repeated, softer this time, as if cementing the words in his son's bones. The twins straightened almost imperceptibly, drawing strength from the contact, from the nod Malik had given, from Rochelle's note still folded in Terrence's pocket. Omar's eyes narrowed, not with contempt now, but calculation. Whatever game he thought he was playing, it was no longer a performance for his amusement. Something heavier had entered the room. Intent, resolve, a sense that these boys weren't bluffing about anything. Victor looked from one to the other, searching for a crack. None showed. Omar finally spoke, voice quieter than before. "All right," he said, measured. "Let's see just how far this possibility of yours can go." Terrence reached for the folder again, sliding a single sheet free from the stack. He laid it flat on the glass, turning it so the bold Arabic text faced Omar. "This line," he said, tapping a phrase near the bottom, "was in the contract for your $60 million shipment deal." Omar's gaze sharpened. "That's the agreement with the Gulf investors." Terrence nodded. "Whoever translated this swapped mustajil, urgent, with mubashir, immediate action. It reads as if you demanded results before they'd even secured customs clearance." He kept his voice even, almost clinical. "They didn't back out because of shipping delays. They backed out because you sounded reckless." Omar blinked once, memory surfacing. The video call 2 weeks earlier. The investors' puzzled faces, a pause after his closing line. He'd chalked it up to a bad connection. Tobias leaned in, finger tracing a second paragraph. Here the phrase for binding timeline was rendered as soft target. "That single word changes the penalty clause. You gave them room to walk." Victor coughed into his fist, quick to intercept. "We hire professionals for that translation work. One freelancer botching a sentence doesn't prove—" "It wasn't one," Tobias said, eyes steady. "We saw the same drift in 2 other contracts. Same hand, same habit." Omar looked down at the sheet again, jaw tightening. For years, deals had slipped through. Small leaks he blamed on market timing or bad luck. Now a thread of cause ran clear across the page. Terrence slid another document across, a clean English copy. "Your Arabic here," he said, "suggests penalties start at signature, not delivery. They could have demanded damages before you shipped anything." Victor straightened in his chair. "If there were errors, legal should have caught them. Not 2 kids rifling through papers they don't understand." Thomas's voice cut the space, calm but edged. "They understand enough to keep you from bleeding millions." He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. Omar's fingers hovered above the contract, then lowered, tracing the line Terrence had marked. The Arabic script glinted under the overhead lights, mercilessly clear. Tobias folded his arms. "We didn't guess," he said quietly. "We compared the Arabic draft to every revision in your archive. The mistakes weren't random." Omar exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing as if the room itself had shifted. For the first time, the billionaire wasn't assessing their nerve. He was calculating losses already made, deals gone sour, all hanging on a few misplaced words. The city hummed beyond the glass, steady and distant, while inside the air turned tight, waiting for who would speak next. Tobias slid a second folder across the glass, heavier than the first. Pages fanned out, neat columns marked in ink, Arabic on one side, English on the other, highlights weaving a map through the text. "It's not just that one deal," he said. "We found a pattern." Omar raised an eyebrow but leaned closer. Terrence rotated a page so the heading faced the billionaire. Revenue lost to translation drift. Last 24 months. "Your files aren't leaking information," Tobias continued, voice steady. "They're leaking precision." He pointed to a row of contracts. "These 3 agreements with North Africa all used the same translator. Each has deadlines softened by a single verb. Average loss, 2.3 million. Terrence tapped another sheet. These, he said, sliding his finger down a column, show phrases about penalty triggers. In one draft, the clause reads, "Only if delivery is late." In the Arabic, it reads, "Only if delivery is late or incomplete." That extra word let them reject half a shipment and still charge fees. Omar's jaw worked once. Slow. His eyes flicked from page to page, absorbing the numbers written in Tobias's clean hand. Victor shifted, restless. Anyone could cherry-pick errors and call it a system. Tobias didn't look up. "We didn't cherry-pick," he said. He opened a stapled packet, a one-page summary titled Recommendation, Translation Unit Restructure. "You've been outsourcing everything piecemeal. No oversight, no language quality control. We mapped every contract to the freelancer who touched it. That's where the revenue bled." Terrence slid the proposal closer. "You need an internal team. 2 in-house Arabic specialists, 1 senior editor, and rotating peer review. It's cheaper than the money you're losing." Omar traced the graph at the bottom. Red bars shrinking as a clean line climbed upward. For the first time since the twins walked in, his expression softened into thought instead of mockery. Victor forced a chuckle, brittle. "You expect him to take business advice from teenagers?" Thomas leaned against the edge of the table, arms folded, gaze steady. "He'd be smart to." Omar didn't answer right away. He set his elbows on the glass, fingers pressed together, eyes fixed on the analysis in front of him. The pages weren't guesses. They were evidence arranged with the discipline of someone who'd spent hours piecing a puzzle together. Terrence waited, calm but alert, while Tobias held his breath for just a beat. The billionaire's silence wasn't rejection anymore. It was calculation, and for the first time the twins could feel the floor tilt, just slightly, toward them. Night in the Bronx pressed against the thin windows, neon from a bodega sign flickering across the living room wall. Their apartment was small, the kind where every sound carried. Thomas worked the heavy bag in the corner, fists thudding against canvas in a steady rhythm. Sweat darkened the collar of his t-shirt, but his eyes stayed on his son's. Terrence and Tobias knelt by the far wall where they'd taped sheets of paper in neat rows. Marker lines connected bullet points like a web. Steps to win. At the center, a circle labeled Proof, arrows shooting outward. Contract errors, credentials, Arabic test, community behind us. Tobias stepped back, chewing the cap of the marker. "We lead with the contract," he said, thinking aloud. "Then show them the credentials. Hit the language piece when they doubt." Terrence drew another arrow, voice low but sure. "And leave the scholarship demand for after the recorder. That's leverage, not bait." Thomas drove one last hook into the bag, let it swing, then wiped his face with a towel. "Talk clean," he said. "Short sentences. Don't let them drag you off point." He crossed to the wall, scanning the map they'd built. "And remember?" His hand landed on Tobias's shoulder, firm, reassuring. "They're not smarter than you. They just have bigger rooms." The twins traded a look, silent understanding passing between them. Tobias jotted a final note at the edge of the paper. "Stay steady when they laugh." Terrence taped it high, right above eye level, so they'd see it every time doubt crept in. From the kitchen, the smell of Rochelle's bread hung faintly in the air, a quiet echo of the block rooting for them. Thomas glanced toward the hallway, where their backpacks waited, packed tight with evidence. He clapped his hands once, sharp, the sound bouncing off cracked plaster. "All right," he said, "get some rest. Tomorrow you don't walk in there asking permission. You walk in there proving they were wrong about you." The boys nodded, eyes on the tangle of arrows and notes they'd built out of nothing but grit and library paper. Outside, a train rumbled along the tracks, fading into the night as the room settled into focused calm. The stillness that comes before a fight you know you're ready for. The folder between them was still open when Tobias's phone buzzed, a small vibration against the glass. He flicked a glance at Terrence, then turned the screen so only his brother could see. A voice note banner glowed. Professor Elaine Carter. He tapped play. Her voice filled the quiet, low and clear, carrying the same weight it had in library study rooms. Truth plus preparation beats arrogance, she said. Always has. Terrence felt the words slot into place, steady as a lock clicking shut. He remembered Carter's calm during late-night drills, the way she'd made them argue clauses in 3 languages until they owned each sentence. Victor frowned. "What's that?" he asked, suspicion edging his tone. "Just a reminder," Tobias said, slipping the phone face down beside the documents. Omar didn't speak. His eyes flicked between the boys, noting how the message had tightened their focus instead of distracting them. Thomas stood a little taller behind them, reading the shift in their posture. He caught a fragment of their quiet breath, the way fighters steady before stepping back into the ring. Terrence drew a page toward him, pen tapping once as he underlined a figure. Tobias mirrored the gesture, nodding almost imperceptibly. The message had pulled them back to center. A single, sure anchor inside the swirl of marble floors, billion-dollar deals, and the COO's thin smirk. Victor tried again, voice light but eyes too sharp. "Coaches now? This is turning into a pep rally." Tobias didn't bite. "Just someone who knows what it takes to win," he said, measured, letting the words hang without heat. Omar leaned back, fingers steepled, watching how quickly the boys had absorbed the advice and returned to work. Something flickered behind his face. Curiosity, maybe respect, though he masked it under practiced neutrality. Thomas gave a slight nod, not toward Omar or Victor, but toward the phone resting between the contracts. The boys caught it, the signal that they had every right to keep standing their ground. The city hummed beyond the glass, muted by the room's heavy stillness. Inside, 2 young voices carried an unspoken promise. They were ready for the next strike, and this time, they wouldn't just defend. They'd own the floor. Tobias rested a hand on the folder, then slipped the other into his jacket pocket. When it came out, a small digital recorder gleamed in his palm, its red light, waiting. He set it on the glass table, just far enough from the contracts for everyone to see. Victor's brows drew together. "What's that supposed to be?" Tobias pressed play. A faint hiss filled the room, followed by Omar's unmistakable voice, clipped and sure. "Black hires slow productivity. We can't afford sentimentality in senior roles." The words cut through the penthouse hush. There was a pause, then Victor's own tone joined, casual and dry. "Exactly. Keep them in maintenance. Good optics, cheap labor. Just don't let them near core operations." Silence settled like dust after a hammer strike. Out in the hall, Malik froze mid-step, head turning toward the sound. Behind him, 2 janitors carrying cleaning gear paused, eyes narrowing as the recording continued. Omar's expression hardened, the easy polish draining from his face. "That," he began, but the voice on the recorder overrode him, finishing a line about dead weight in middle management. Thomas's jaw locked. He didn't speak, but the tension across his shoulders was enough to pull every gaze his way. Victor shot to his feet, chair scraping. "This is out of context," he said, too fast. "A private conversation, recorded in the elevator last week," Tobias said evenly. "Public enough for anyone riding between floors." Terrence leaned forward, steady. "You weren't talking about performance. You were talking about skin." Malik stepped just inside the doorway now, eyes fixed on the recorder. The janitors behind him edged closer, their presence quiet but heavy. Omar's fingers twitched on the arm of his chair, a rare crack in the billionaire's control. "You don't know what was being discussed," he said, voice lower than before, not quite finding its authority. Thomas finally spoke, deep and calm. "I know exactly what I just heard." Victor reached for the recorder, but Tobias slid it an inch out of reach without looking up. "Touch it and the file goes live," he said, voice still level. The room held its breath. Even the city noise beyond the glass felt remote, waiting. Terrence broke the pause, tone quiet but precise. "You built a system where people like us clean up after you, and you laughed about keeping it that way. That's not a mistake in a contract. That's who you decided we were. Omar stared at the device, jaw tight, calculating damage. Headlines, lawsuits, the faces gathering at the door. His gaze flicked to Thomas, then to the boys, then to the workers standing witness. The recorder kept playing, each sentence another nail in a story they could no longer deny. By the time the final click of stopped audio echoed, the stakes had shifted from numbers on paper to reputations, careers, and the walls that had always protected the men across the table. Thomas stepped forward, boots solid against the marble. The quiet that followed the recorder's last click stretched thin, brittle. His shoulders squared, jaw set like stone. "You won't spit on my son's worth," he said, voice low but sharp enough to slice through the room. Omar's gaze flicked up, startled by the shift in tone. The billionaire had seen defiance before. Lawyers, rivals, board members, but never a janitor standing tall between him and the damage of his own words. Victor opened his mouth, ready with another excuse, but Thomas's stare pinned him in place. "Don't," Thomas warned, one syllable, steady as a hammer coming down. He turned back to Omar. "They didn't break into your files to humiliate you," he said, measured. "They worked nights while I cleaned these floors. They earned every piece of paper sitting on that table, and you sat there, ready to write them off before you even listened." Malik shifted near the doorway, eyes steady, a quiet ally holding the line. The other janitors behind him stayed silent, their presence anchoring the room. Thomas stepped closer to the glass table, the faint scuff of his boot loud in the stillness. "You have power," he said, meeting Omar's eyes head-on. "But you don't get to use it to decide who matters." For a moment, Omar didn't speak. His fingers hovered near the edge of the recorder, then pulled back. Victor tried again, thin smile forced. "Thomas, let's be rational." "Rational?" Thomas's voice cut through, calm but heavy. "Rational is knowing talent when it's standing in front of you. Rational is not burning a company down with prejudice you can't even admit." The room seemed smaller, air tighter around the polished table. Terrence and Tobias stayed rooted behind their father, faces calm but eyes bright, their quiet strength mirrored in his stance. Omar leaned back slightly, searching for footing. For the first time since the meeting began, the billionaire wasn't steering the current. He was bracing against it. Thomas let the silence settle, then spoke once more, deliberate. "You asked for proof. They gave you more than you deserved. Now you need to decide whether you'll see them for what they are, or keep hiding behind a lie that's already on tape." The challenge hung there, unmistakable. The balance in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Terrence stepped forward, calm settling over him, like a second skin. He gathered the loose sheets into a single stack, squared the corners, and set them back on the table with quiet precision. "Here's what happens next," he said, voice steady enough to cut through the room's heavy silence. Omar's eyes flicked from Terrence to Tobias, then to Thomas standing just behind them, solid as a wall. Terrence kept talking, each word measured. 1. My father's salary increases to $80,000, and he's promoted to facilities supervisor. 2. You establish a scholarship fund for kids from our neighborhood. 10 slots a year. 3. You hire us as junior language consultants. He paused only long enough to let the list settle. We've already saved you more than those positions will ever cost. Victor barked a short laugh, too loud for the quiet. Hostage demands, he said, leaning back in his chair as if the label alone could shatter their leverage. You think you can waltz in here, wave a recorder, and name your price? Tobias didn't blink. We don't name prices, he said evenly. We set terms for fixing what you let break. Thomas kept his gaze on Omar, not Victor, a steady presence behind the boys. Terrence slid a single sheet from the folder, a crisp page titled Proposed Agreement. Everything's written, he said. Sign now, and this room stays private. Refuse, and the recording leaves with us. Omar studied the paper without moving to touch it. His face was still, but the weight behind his eyes had changed. Calculation had replaced disdain. Victor's smirk wavered. "You're bluffing," he said, though not as firmly as before. Tobias tapped the recorder once with a fingertip. "Try us." The janitors gathered by the door stayed silent, their attention locked on the table. Malik shifted just enough to plant his boots, the quiet signal of someone ready to stand witness if things turned ugly. Thomas placed a hand on Terrence's shoulder, not to guide him back, but to underline the strength in what had just been said. Omar's gaze returned to the conditions, lingering on each line. The faintest crease cut across his brow as he read scholarship fund, junior consultants. He wasn't hearing a shakedown anymore. He was staring at a business solution wrapped inside an ultimatum. Terrence met his eyes, calm, unwavering. "You asked for proof," he said. "That's ours. Now we need yours." The room stayed taut, a breath waiting to break, while Omar considered which side of history, and his own empire, he wanted to stand on. Tobias reached into his pocket again, slow and deliberate, drawing out a slim phone with a cracked corner. He set it beside the recorder, screen facing up, and tapped once. A countdown clock bloomed in red. 0500. The digits began to fall. Victor leaned forward, frowning. "What's that supposed to be?" "Time," Tobias said, voice calm but edged. 5 minutes to decide." Omar's gaze flicked from the clock to the boys. He didn't speak, but the small movement of his jaw betrayed calculation. Terrence pulled a second item from his bag, a dark USB stick, its metal surface catching the light. He placed it on the glass, next to the papers and recorder. "Everything you heard," he said, "plus every note, every file about those contracts. A copy of this sits with a community attorney in Mott Haven." Tobias added, "Another with Professor Carter. If anything happens to us, or if you try to bury this, the evidence goes public." Victor barked a laugh, too loud for the quiet. "You're bluffing. Kids with toys." Thomas's eyes snapped toward him, the warning in his look enough to still the room. "Watch your tone," he said, voice low but carrying. Malik shifted closer to the doorway, stance wide, gaze fixed on the clock counting down. Behind him, the janitors stayed rooted, silent witnesses as the seconds ticked away. Terrence folded his hands on the table, posture composed. "We don't want a war," he said. "We want fairness. But if you think we'll walk out empty-handed, you're not listening." Omar leaned back slightly, eyes on the shrinking numbers. 0401. 04. The sound of the timer, a faint digital pulse, filled the penthouse, louder than the city below. Tobias rested his fingertips on the USB. "We're not bluffing," he said, the quiet finality in his tone cutting cleaner than any threat. For a long moment, no one moved. Omar's gaze swept the table. The contracts, the ultimatum, the timer bleeding seconds away, then settled on the twins. Their faces held steady, no flicker of nerves left. Thomas stood behind them, still as a post, every inch of him saying he would hold the line if they needed him to. The timer slid past 3 minutes 50, the digits reflecting in the polished glass. Omar's fingers twitched once, then stilled. The game had shifted. He was no longer the man entertaining a stunt. He was the one cornered by the clarity of preparation. Victor's chair scraped hard against the floor. In one motion, he lunged across the table, fingers snatching for the USB. "Enough games," he snapped, voice jagged with something colder than mockery. Thomas moved faster, his hand clamped around Victor's wrist before it reached the drive, grip iron solid. The sudden contact rang louder than the timer's quiet pulse. Thomas leaned in, eyes level, every inch of him a wall. "Don't," he said, voice low, steady. Victor froze, breath caught, but anger flickered in his face. "This isn't your fight, Reed." "It is when you try to steal what keeps my son safe," Thomas replied, calm as stone, but close enough for Victor to see the steel behind his words. Omar stood halfway out of his chair, surprise cutting through his practiced composure. "Victor," he said, sharp. "Sit down." But Victor didn't move. His gaze darted between the billionaire and the twins, calculation running just beneath the surface. "You don't see it, Omar," he said, tone slipping into a bitter edge. "They're holding your empire hostage, and you're too blinded by guilt to stop them. Somebody has to protect the company." Terrence shifted slightly, ready but quiet, while Tobias set the recorder closer to his elbow, thumb hovering above the stop button like a warning. Malik took one step farther into the room, stance wide. The janitors behind him watched with a new tension, their presence no longer just solidarity, it was witness. Omar's attention cut from Victor's clenched fist to the papers on the table, then back. Something in his face hardened. "Protect the company," he repeated, voice slow, dangerous. "Or protect yourself?" Victor's eyes flickered, just for a second, enough to confirm what Omar had begun to suspect. Thomas eased Victor's wrist down onto the glass, firm but measured. "You don't get to rewrite the rules because you're scared," he said. "Not with my boys in the crossfire." Victor yanked his arm back, glaring at Thomas, then at the twins. "You think this ends with a scholarship and a promotion? They'll bleed you for more." Omar straightened, shoulders squaring as the line between ally and threat clarified. "Step back, Victor," he said, the command quiet but edged. For a moment, Victor hesitated, caught between pride and prudence. Then he shoved his chair back, retreating just enough to make space, but not surrendering the glare. Thomas stayed standing, body angled slightly toward his sons, guarding the table where the USB and recorder sat gleaming. The countdown on Tobias's phone slipped past 2 minutes, numbers glowing against the glass. Silent proof that the balance of power in the room had shifted again, and not in Victor Hale's favor. Omar stayed standing, fingers pressed against the glass table, eyes fixed on the neat stack of papers. The timer on Tobias's phone bled down to 1:40. Its red glow reflected across the polished surface. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the air system and the faint street noise far below. Then Omar reached for the pen. His hand hovered, hesitated once, then closed with decision. He bent over the page and signed his name in a clean, deliberate stroke. When the ink settled, he let the pen drop with a soft clink. "Real intelligence isn't birthright," he said, voice quieter than it had been all afternoon. "It's built." The words settled in the room like a seal. Malik, still at the door, straightened almost imperceptibly. The other janitors exchanged glances, silent but charged. Omar turned his gaze to Victor. "You're suspended," he said. No heat, just a verdict. "Effective immediately. Security will collect your badge." Victor's mouth opened, closed again. Whatever argument he'd prepared died under Omar's steady stare. He gathered himself, retreating a step from the table, the edge of defiance already slipping. Thomas placed a steady hand on Tobias's shoulder, then Terrence's, anchoring them both. Pride warmed the stern line of his face. It wasn't triumph, but recognition. The look of a man who had fought for space his whole life and finally watched his sons claim theirs. Omar sank back into his chair, posture changed. No longer the man amused by an afternoon's disruption, but someone weighing the cost of old habits against the value of what stood before him. He glanced at the proposal again, reading the scholarship clause, the title for Thomas, the consultant roles. Slowly, a breath escaped him. Not surrender, but acceptance. Terrence closed the folder, sliding it toward Omar. Tobias tapped the timer, stopping the count at 37 seconds. The room released a breath none of them knew they'd been holding. Malik stepped forward, offering a subtle nod to the twins before easing the door wider for the janitors behind him. Their presence filled the space with quiet witness. The victory didn't belong only to the family at the table. Thomas gave his son's shoulders one last squeeze. "You held the line," he murmured, pride roughening his voice. Tobias looked from the signed agreement to Omar, then to Victor retreating toward the exit. Terrence stood a little taller, calm settling where adrenaline had been. Outside, the city kept moving, horns and voices threading up from the avenue. Inside, the balance of power had shifted for good, a contract inked, an old prejudice exposed, and a father's steady hands resting on the proof of what resilience could build. The Bronx library buzzed with voices instead of its usual hush. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, falling across rows of folding chairs, and a long table stacked with fresh folders stamped Reed Scholars, scholarship packet. Children from the neighborhood lined up, sneakers squeaking on the tile, waiting their turn. Malik stood near the entrance, crisp in his security jacket, but grinning like a proud uncle. Rochelle bustled by with a tray of pastries, pressing a roll into a shy girl's hands. "Eat first, then read," she said, wagging a finger good-naturedly. Mr. Langston hovered near the sign-up desk, sleeves rolled, helping a boy spell his name on the clipboard. At the front, a banner stretched across a book cart, celebrating the first Reed Scholars. Beside it, Omar Al-Farouk stood with his hands clasped, posture careful, a man learning how to be a guest rather than a master. The billionaire inclined his head as kids brushed past, his usual polish muted by something closer to humility. Terrence and Tobias moved through the crowd, handing out packets, explaining forms. "Section 2's where you write your goals," Terrence told a middle schooler, pointing to a blank line. Tobias crouched beside a younger boy, showing him where to print neatly. Thomas lingered by the back wall, arms folded but eyes bright. He watched Rochelle laugh with Langston, Malik high-five a student, Omar stoop awkwardly to help a child steady her pen. The scene pulsed with a quiet pride that belonged to more than one family. "Good turnout," Malik said, joining Thomas. "Better than good," Thomas answered, gaze on his sons. They earned every page on those tables. Omar approached then, hesitant, as if unsure how close he was welcome. He cleared his throat. "You were right," he said softly. "Talent grows where you tend it, not where you wall it off." Thomas nodded once, a gesture both acknowledgement and warning. "Keep tending," he said. Across the room, Tobias lifted a folder high, voice carrying over the chatter. "Next group for intake." Laughter rippled, the line shuffled forward. Sunlight shifted, glinting off the embossed lettering on each packet. Reed Scholars, a name stitched from resilience, strategy, and a city that had decided to show up for its own. Thomas let the noise settle around him, pages turning, chairs sliding, the small gasp of a kid realizing a scholarship might belong to them. He looked at Terrence and Tobias guiding a cluster of students to the reading tables and felt the weight of every long shift, every quiet hour spent building armor for this moment. In the heart of the library, with old stacks watching like sentinels, a new chapter had begun. Not about contracts or leverage, but about what could grow when proof met purpose and a community chose to rise together. Chatter swelled in the library's main hall, a low, warm current rolling beneath the high ceiling. Folding chairs filled every aisle between the stacks. Kids clutched their new scholarship packets. Parents and neighbors lined the walls, shoulders brushing shelves of well-worn books. At the front, Thomas Reed stood behind a narrow podium borrowed from the reading room. Terrence and Tobias flanked him, packets still tucked under their arms. Malik leaned against a column, grinning wide. Rochelle balanced a tray of pastries on one hip. Even Omar hovered at the edge, subdued, hands clasped behind his back. Thomas cleared his throat once. The room stilled. "Behind every triumph," he said, voice carrying just enough, "a village stands." He paused, letting the words find a place among the rows of faces. "My sons may have done the talking, but every late shift, every lesson, every loaf of bread, every quiet nod, it's all standing right here." A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Langston lifted a fist in quiet salute. Rochelle dabbed at the corner of one eye before turning back to refill a plate. Malik straightened, pride plain on his face. Thomas continued, measured, but strong. "People told us worth comes from titles, from rooms like the one we walked into last week. But I've learned it's built. In libraries, in kitchens, in hallways where someone says, 'Keep going.' That's what carried us to this table. The camera of someone's phone panned across the back of the hall, catching janitors from Omar's building, still in work polos, hands clasped, smiling. They stood together near the door, quiet pride written across their faces. Terrence glanced at them, then at his father, and nodded once. Tobias mirrored the motion, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. Omar shifted, as if feeling the weight of a room he once would have overlooked. He gave a small, almost tentative clap. Others joined, scattered at first, then stronger, until applause filled the hall like sunlight breaking through glass. Thomas looked at his sons, then at the crowd that had gathered. Guards, cleaners, teachers, neighbors, kids on tiptoe to see. "Keep standing for each other," he said. "That's how we build the kind of future no one gets to shut down." The applause rose again, layered with laughter and the shuffle of chairs as people surged forward to congratulate the twins. Among them, the janitors from the skyscraper raised their hands in quiet waves, faces alight with something steady and proud, proof that this victory belonged to every hand that had lifted them along the way. Omar drifted from the crowd as applause rolled through the library. He stopped near a side window where dust floated in a beam of afternoon light. For a moment he watched the twins laughing with Rochelle, Thomas clasping hands with Malik. Their voices blurred, replaced by an older sound, the scrape of chairs in a classroom 25 years earlier. He was 17 again, a new arrival from Beirut, thin shoulders drowning in a second-hand blazer. The teacher had asked him to read aloud. He'd stumbled over the word through, tongue heavy, vowels tangled. A boy at the back of the room had snickered, and then others joined in, their laughter sharp against the walls. Omar had swallowed hard, staring at the page until the letters blurred. That day he'd promised himself no one would ever laugh at him for language again. He'd learned fast, climbed faster, built walls of polish around every word he spoke, until he'd forgotten what the climb was for. The memory loosened as he turned back to the present. Children paging through scholarship packets, janitors standing straighter than usual, Thomas's hand resting on Tobias's shoulder. Omar's reflection in the glass looked older than he expected, not just by years, but by the weight of compromises. He breathed in, steadying. The boy who once fought for every syllable would have seen himself in these kids, would have cheered for their right to be heard. Somewhere along the road, ambition had drowned that voice. Omar let his hand rest on the sill, eyes following a young girl carefully tracing her name on a form. Pride flickered. Not for himself, but for the chance to help clear the path he'd once walked. He glanced again at the twins, catching Terrence's quick smile, Tobias's focused calm. For the first time in a long while, Omar felt the weight of old laughter slide off his shoulders, leaving space for something quieter, truer. The room behind him stirred with possibility, and in the window's reflection he almost recognized the boy who had come here believing that language could open doors for anyone willing to learn. A week later, the top floor of Al Farouk Industries buzzed with a different kind of tension. A delegation from Tokyo filled the conference room, dark suits crisp against the pale skyline. Papers lay neatly stacked beside porcelain cups of green tea. Terrence sat at one end of the table, posture straight but relaxed, listening as the lead negotiator spoke in quick Japanese. He waited for a breath, then translated every clause into clean, precise English. No pause, no searching. Just steady rhythm, as if the language lived inside him. Across from him, Tobias flipped through a slim binder, eyes scanning the bilingual draft of the contract. He underlined one clause with a fine pen, then slid the page toward Omar. "Penalty window," he murmured. "The Japanese says 7 business days. The English reads 1 week, not the same if there's a holiday." Omar glanced at the line, then at Tobias, surprise flickering before he masked it with a nod. "Good catch." The lead negotiator smiled faintly at Terrence's phrasing, then added a final remark. Terrence delivered it word for word, tone polite but firm, sealing the terms with a nod. At the back of the room, Thomas stood with Malik, their presence quiet, but grounding. Rochelle and Mr. Langston waited near the door, invited guests watching the boys claim a table once closed to people like them. When the documents were signed, a reporter from Forbes, notebook in hand, stepped forward. "Terrence Tobias," she said, voice bright. "You're the youngest consultants we've ever seen at a deal this size. What's your advice to other young people?" Tobias exchanged a glance with his brother, then leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Keep receipts," he said, steady. "Keep dignity," Terrence added, "and don't let anyone convince you don't belong at the table. Bring proof, bring respect. The rest follows." Omar looked at the twins, then at Thomas, a faint smile tracing the edge of his mouth. Pride, tempered by humility, settled across his face. The reporter scribbled quickly, then lifted her phone for a photo. The shutter clicked, catching Thomas behind his sons, hands on their shoulders, the Tokyo skyline gleaming through the window behind them. Outside, traffic moved like a quiet river beneath the skyscrapers, but inside, the air carried the hum of new ground broken, a deal secured, a family steady, and proof that preparation, once met with opportunity, could rewrite the script of who deserved to stand in the room. The late afternoon sun spilled through the library windows, turning the rows of faces into warm silhouettes. Folding chairs had been pushed aside. People stood shoulder to shoulder, filling the reading room until even the aisles between the stacks were crowded. Thomas stood in the center, Terrence and Tobias on either side. The boys held their scholarship packets, corners slightly bent from all the hands that had touched them in congratulations. Malik clapped from near the doorway, grin bright as the gold lettering on the new banner overhead. Rochelle balanced a tray of rolls she'd been handing out since morning, eyes shining behind her glasses. Mr. Langston lifted his chin, an old fighter's pride sparking in the gesture. Applause swelled again, rolling through the room like a tide. Thomas glanced at the twins, steady, composed, but their eyes alive, and then at the faces circling them, janitors in clean work shirts, parents with small children perched on their hips, students holding pens like promises. He raised a hand, letting the sound fade to a hush. "Today isn't about one contract," he said, voice calm but firm. "It isn't even about just us." He scanned the room, meeting eyes across the space. It's about what happens when people refuse to stay small and when a community decides to make room for every kid who dares to reach higher. Terrence felt Tobias shift slightly, the quiet charge between them an echo of every late night spent rehearsing lines and marking errors in cramped margins. Thomas went on, slower now. "Behind every step forward, there's someone holding the light. You all held it for us. And for them." He gestured toward the cluster of children waiting for their turn to register. A ripple of warmth passed through the room. Rochelle dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Langston nodded once, sharp and proud. Malik's hands met again, firm applause that spread until everyone was clapping, cheering, stamping feet against the worn floor. As the sound lifted, a voiceover wrapped around the moment, quiet, steady, carrying the weight of truth. "Real wealth lives in every child given room to rise. It's written in the hours mentors lend, in hands that steady a ladder, in the breath someone takes before saying, 'I believe in you.'" The camera of a bystander caught Thomas pulling the twins close, his arms draped over their shoulders. Terrence's grin was quick, Tobias's steadier, but both mirrored the same spark of belonging. The applause built again, louder, until it felt like the old walls themselves were applauding, the shelves, the worn tables, the years of stories stored inside. Thomas looked over the crowd, eyes sweeping past Omar standing respectfully near the back, past Malik and Rochelle, to the smallest children clapping with open palms. "Keep making space," he said, voice quiet but sure. "That's how we all rise." And for one long moment, the room stood together. Voices, hands, hearts, holding open the possibility they had built together, proof that dignity and preparation could grow a future large enough for everyone. Laughter still hummed around the reading room when Tobias dipped a hand into his pocket. He pulled out a tiny silver USB, its surface catching a slice of afternoon sun. With an easy grin, he held it up between thumb and forefinger. "Backups," he said, eyes sliding to Terrence, then Thomas, "are good insurance." For a split second, the room went still, surprise, then delight washing over the crowd. Rochelle let out a sharp laugh, covering her mouth with the edge of a napkin. Malik shook his head, chuckling. Even Omar, standing near the back, cracked a reluctant smile, the first completely unguarded expression anyone had seen from him all day. Terrence rolled his eyes with mock patience, though a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You couldn't let this moment stay serious, huh?" "Serious is overrated," Tobias said, sliding the USB back into his pocket. "But prepared? Never." Thomas gave both boys a squeeze on the shoulders, the gesture saying what words didn't need to. Pride, relief, the quiet thrill of knowing they'd steered a storm and landed standing. Around them, voices rose again, kids comparing scholarship packets, Rochelle offering more bread, Langston giving a mini-lecture about filling out forms correctly. Malik leaned near the door, nodding to a cluster of janitors who'd come from the high-rise, their smiles broad and certain. The camera's frame widened, drifting backward. The crowd shrank into a mosaic of movement and light, Omar shaking hands with Langston, a little girl sounding out words from her new packet while Rochelle bent low to listen, sunlight spilling through wide windows, catching dust that floated like soft confetti. From somewhere deeper in the library came the faint sing-song of children practicing letters, their voices overlapping in eager rhythm. The sound folded into the laughter, into the murmur of neighbors and mentors, until the whole room felt threaded with promise. Thomas looked once more at his sons, Terrence composed, Tobias still carrying that sly edge, and let a breath leave his chest, slow and full. He knew there would be more rooms, more battles, but this one had been claimed with truth, grit, and proof no one could ignore. The camera eased farther back, capturing the full sweep of shelves, sunlit tables, and a community gathered around its own. The last image held, 2 boys standing steady beside their father, light spilling across the floor, while the low music of kids learning to read drifted up, steady and clear. A quiet anthem for every voice still waiting to rise. Sunlight lingered across the library floor, turning the dust into tiny sparks. Terrence and Tobias stayed close to Thomas as neighbors, mentors, and janitors milled around them, still talking, still smiling. The camera drifted once more across the banner, Reed Scholars, then up to the high windows where the city stretched far beyond. A calm voiceover settled over the scene. From a penthouse challenge to a library filled with new beginnings, this story proves something simple. Real power isn't in money or titles. It's in the proof you carry, the voices that stand with you, and the courage to step forward even when the room wasn't built for you. The shot tightened on Thomas, his hand steady on his son's shoulders. They looked up at him, a small trio standing against the sweep of shelves and sunlight. Wherever you are, whatever you're fighting to build, keep receipts, keep dignity, and never let anyone shrink what you were meant to grow. The voice softened into a closing beat as the camera pulled wide, a single frame of the library alive with laughter, pages turning, and a future being written in real time. On screen, bold text faded in. If this story moved you, help us keep telling stories that lift voices and break ceilings. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this video so more people know their worth can't be measured by someone else's limits. A final line hovered just above the subscribe button. Stand tall, help someone else rise.